Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by the one and only Helena, aka No Justice MTG, on YouTube and Twitch. Helena, how are you doing? It's been a very busy news day. How have you been taking it all in?
It has been a very big news day, definitely a lot for us to get our teeth into. As for myself, I'm still recovering from quite a bad cold, so apologies if I sound a bit hoarse this evening.
Oh, I'm really sorry. It's all over the place in our offices as well. Wishing you a speedy recovery. Coming up on tonight's show, we'll look at the latest news from Lebanon and speak to Dr. Maha Shwaib from the Center for Lebanese Studies at Cambridge. Ukraine says Russia has launched an intercontinental ballistic missile into Ukrainian territory. And later in the show, I'll be joined by Francesca Fiorentini to discuss whether left pessimism has taken hold since Trump's election. Today, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza. The Hague have also issued an arrest warrant for Hamas military chief Mohammed Daif.
The court has just issued these arrest warrants, 3 arrest warrants, one for Hamas leader known as Daif and 2 for the Israeli leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The arrest warrants are for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed from at least October 8, 2023, until the request for the arrest warrants was issued by the prosecutor 6 months ago on May the 20th. There have been some really serious delays for issuing these arrest warrants. There was a lot of questions about if the ICC was capable of doing so, despite a lot of rejections by the parties that are involved in the ICC, especially also from Europe, from Germany, but also Israel has very much tried to avoid this by filing all kinds of complaints. But the ICC has now decided to reject these complaints, and they have said that these arrest warrants should now be issued.
It's very difficult to overestimate the significance of these warrants. It's the first time that leaders of a Western aligned state have been charged by the court. Here are the grounds outlined by the ICC for Netanyahu and Gallant's arrest warrants. The chamber considered that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both individuals intentionally and knowingly deprived the civilian population in Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, including food, water and medicine and medical supplies, as well as fuel and electricity from at least 8th of October 2023 to the 20th of May 2024. The statement goes on. The chamber found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the lack of food, water, electricity, and fuel and specific medical supplies created conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of part of the civilian population in Gaza, which resulted in the death of civilians, including children, due to malnutrition and dehydration. In addition, by intentionally limiting or preventing medical supplies and medicine from getting into Gaza, in particular anesthetics and anesthesia machines, the 2 individuals are also responsible for inflicting great suffering by means of inhumane acts on persons in need of treatment. Doctors were forced to operate on wounded persons and carry out amputations, including on children, without anesthetics, and or were forced to use inadequate and unsafe means to sedate patients, causing these persons extreme pain and suffering. This amounts to the crime against humanity of other inhumane acts. And one final point from the statement that's really important to highlight. The chamber assessed that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant bear criminal responsibility as civilian superiors for the war crime of intentionally directing attacks against the civilian populations of Gaza. So what do these arrest warrants mean in practice? Well, they mean that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant risk arrest if they travel to any of the 124 member countries that signed the Rome Statute founding the International Criminal Court. Now, Israel is not a member of the ICC, and neither is the US, but Britain is. And in October, Attorney General Richard Hermer said that the UK would obey its international obligations with respect to any order issued by the ICC. Keir Starmer's spokesperson today indicated that the UK would respect the ruling, saying, quote, "We respect the independence of the International Criminal Court and confirming that there has been no government policy change on its position on the ICC." Former human rights lawyer Starmer has yet to directly comment, but so far the Netherlands has said it is prepared to act on the arrest warrants, and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the country will abide by all rulings of international courts. Jordan's foreign minister, that's Israel's neighbour, also said that the ICC's decision must be implemented, while Spain's Labour Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Yolanda Diaz suggested that Spain would respect the arrest warrants. Unsurprisingly, senior Israeli figures have been quick to condemn the ICC, with Netanyahu's office denouncing the ruling as anti-Semitic and absurd and false lies. Israeli President Isaac Herzog said this on X. "This is a dark day for justice, a dark day for humanity. Taken in bad faith, the outrageous decision at the ICC has turned universal justice into a universal laughingstock. It makes a mockery of the sacrifice of all those who fight for justice, from the Allied victory over the Nazis till today." And National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir responded by posting this. "The response to the arrest warrants, applying sovereignty over all areas of Judea and Samaria, Jewish settlement throughout the entire land." So his response to the arrest warrant for breaking international law is to just break some more international law and completely occupy the Palestinian territories. The White House has said it, quote, fundamentally rejects the ICC's warrants and that the ICC does not have jurisdiction on the matter. This is despite the Biden administration welcoming the ICC's arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin and other Russian officials for war crimes in Ukraine last year. The ICC's three-judge panel also said it found reasonable grounds to believe Hamas's Mohammed Deif was responsible for crimes against humanity and war crimes relating to the 7th of October attack. But Israel claims to have killed Mohammed Deif over the summer, although his death has not been confirmed by Hamas. Back in May, when ICC prosecutor Karim Khan sought these warrants, he also included Hamas leaders Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh, who have been killed. In a statement, Hamas called on the International Criminal Court to expand the scope of accountability to all criminal occupation leaders. Now, earlier today, I spoke with lawyer Tayeb Ali, director of the International Center of Justice for Palestinians. The center played a part in collecting and gathering evidence of Israeli crimes and giving them to the ICC. I began by asking him about his reaction to the unprecedented news from the ICC today.
Well, I mean, for me personally, I think it's the most significant international humanitarian law ruling in human history. And I'm not overstating that. I'm not saying it's because it's the worst situation that we've ever seen in our history, or there's other situations aren't as bad as this. It's just simply because Israel has enjoyed impunity from accountability with respect to its occupation. It's now unlawful occupation, the building of settlements, the stealing of property, unlawful detention of human beings, the torture of human beings, the murder of human beings. And it's enjoyed impunity for that for decades. And finally, we have a situation where an international treaty-based court, treaty-based because there's 125 countries across the globe that support the ICC, have decided, the judges of this institution have decided, after looking at evidence, that there are reasonable grounds that Israel has participated in a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population. And the offences are profound: starvation, intentionally targeting civilians, withholding life-sustaining materials, the crime against humanity of murder. I mean, these are phenomenal, the most serious criminal acts you could imagine. And the court has decided that there's reasonable grounds for Israelis, two Israelis in particular, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and also Palestinian Mohammed Deif, to stand trial. And Mohammed Deif for allegations in relation to October the 7th and the taking of hostages.
In the reasoning surrounding the warrants, the court was really explicit about the number of crimes that they find Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu to be implicated in. Now, the Center for Justice for Palestinians, the International Center for Justice for Palestinians, your organization, played a role in gathering and providing evidence to the ICC. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So early on, after October the 7th, we established that Israel's response to October the 7th and its continued occupation of Palestine was disproportionate to anything that had happened to it. And so we thought it would be a really important exercise to establish a rapid investigation team to gather evidence to a British criminal legal standard in a similar mechanism, in a similar methodology to the British police do in our war crimes investigation unit, gather that evidence to establish whether or not Israel was participating in war crimes. So what we did with that is we identified witnesses that were either on the ground and had left Gaza, were in a safe jurisdiction. We met with them. We interviewed them on video. We then secured video and photographic evidence from them and took contemporaneous information from their social media if they had it, put that together in an evidence package, sent those evidence packages to Scotland Yard and to the ICC and to the International Court of Justice, as well as some other domestic legal actions that were happening in various different parts of the world. And clearly, that evidence speaks for itself. I don't want to talk about who the witnesses were, but what I can say to you is they've provided very credible, very compelling evidence of very serious criminal activity by Israeli military forces in Gaza.
So the US has, as totally predictably, said that they don't recognize the ICC's warrants. Other countries, though, have said that they will respect international law, including today the UK. What do you think will happen next? I mean, are we really likely to see the arrest of either Gallant or Netanyahu?
I feel like a little bit of a lone voice because I've been saying that the ICC will do its job from the very beginning because I expected it to do its job. The Rome Statute, something that inspired me before I was even a lawyer to become, as a young fledgling lawyer, want to be lawyer, to become a lawyer. It means a lot. The framework in the Rome Statute is really important. And so now you've got a situation where the International Criminal Court prosecutor lived up to his mandate. The ICC judges have done their job. They've issued warrants. 125 countries around the globe that are members of the ICC now have to do what they're obliged to do by their treaty provisions. That's number one. Number two, you've got also, for example, the United Kingdom. We've incorporated the Rome Statute into domestic law. So it's actually British law, English and Welsh law, that requires the British police to arrest, detain and prosecute suspected breaches of the Rome Statute. So if Netanyahu and Gallant come into the UK, then the police should arrest them. The Crown Prosecution Service should support a prosecution against them, and they should be prosecuted here or handed over to the ICC for prosecution if the United Kingdom doesn't feel it's capable of doing that. Now, you mentioned the United States and Israel. Well, Israel obviously is going to say, well, this is nonsense, this is bias, this is not something that we accept, and the United States has done that. I'll say two things about that. Number one, I'm never surprised by a perpetrator or a suspected perpetrator of war crimes to pretend or say or to take the position that the institution or the accountability and structure around him is somehow biased or unfair. I mean, when was the last time that you had somebody accused of a war crime that said, yes, okay, hands up, I'm guilty of it? It's just very rare and doesn't happen. And then you might take that and extend it to the United States because people are alleging that the United States is complicit in Israel's war crimes because under Article 25 of the Rome Statute, it supplied, aided and abetted the material for that war. And we can see why the ICC might also be very worried. The United States might also be very worried about the arrest warrants and what that might mean for its own actors, own political actors. And some might say that the United States and Israel is not inside the jurisdiction, but the war crimes, the crimes, the allegations occurred on the ground in Gaza, and Gaza is within the ICC's jurisdiction. And so if you can conduct an act, whether you're a member or not a member of the ICC, and you're within the jurisdiction of the ICC, you're liable to be held accountable under the Rome Statute. So it doesn't surprise me in the least. And I don't think we've seen the end of it. We've already seen lots of allegations in newspapers about the way that Mossad and Israeli intelligence services dealt with the previous prosecutor. There's been suggestions about the current prosecutor. I don't think we're at the end of that process. I think we're going to see really despicable action going forward with regard to the ICC from actors that are worried, not about the rule of law or justice, but about their own position within an accountability structure. And one final point about this, we didn't hear the United States or senators of the United States or even the United Kingdom call the ICC prosecutor bias or the ICC bias when it was issuing arrest warrants against Putin and Russia. At that time, it was heralded as the best international humanitarian law institution the world had ever seen. Well, I think that what we've seen happen now maintains that accolade that it's the best international humanitarian law accountability structure that the world has available to it. And for me, at the moment, the ICC is living up to its mandate and its purpose.
That was Tayeb Ali of the International Center of Justice for Palestinians speaking to me earlier today. Now, we have a bit of breaking news for you. Adding themselves to the ranks of justice, Italy have said that they would have to arrest Netanyahu or Gallant if either of them entered the country. So there's another beach holiday they won't be able to take. Helena, I want to bring you in here. This is a truly significant victory for Palestinians and those who support them. So the UK government has said that they will support the rule of law here. Do you think that was a difficult decision for the government to make?
I mean, I don't think it was necessarily a difficult decision. I think we've seen since the election that the softening of the government's positions very slightly, with different small concessions here and there, like the 30 arms licenses being withdrawn, was a very slight concession to the fact that they want to at least appear as though they treat this issue with some level of accountability, even though they don't necessarily do that. 30 arms licenses, that's less than 10% of all arms licenses that we had previously. That doesn't materially affect Israel's ability to commit the war crimes that they have been essentially given these arrest warrants for. They've been sent these arrest warrants for the war crimes that they've committed up until this point, right? The Labour government didn't actually change their material stance on providing weapons, and they admitted it as such. They admitted as such that these weapon licenses will not in any way affect Israel's ability to be able to continue to commit those war crimes that they are being charged with here. What I will think we are going to see, though, we'll almost certainly see a humiliating climb down from Sir Weathervane, because these concessions have been made, not because I believe that they fundamentally ideologically support holding Israel to account, but it's because broadly in our society, in UK society, we support these charges. There's overwhelming support in this country for Netanyahu to be held account for his war crimes, for there to have been an immediate ceasefire for over a year. At this point, there's been public support for this, and of course, the removal of all arms sales. These have all been things that have been supported broadly by the public. And really, the tactical positions that the government has taken to try and maintain popular support is what's relevant here. Although at any point, whether or not Sir Weathervane decides to change his stance wholly, at the end of the day, none of this makes any difference to us. None of this makes any difference at all. Because we don't forget, right? None of us will forget the moment when he said, when being interviewed on LBC, that Israel has the right to cut off water, food, and fuel from Gaza, the central charge that has been handed down by these arrest warrants from the ICC. He said Israel does have that right. They then doubled down on that on ITV News later on that day, and they even sent Emily Thornberry out on Newsnight to defend that stance again. So we can't rewrite history here. They can't just turn on a dime and change positions when they think the wind is blowing in the other direction. Unfortunately, people don't forget moments like these, that there was full-throated support for the kind of crimes that we are seeing, and we are still providing military aid for them. We're still providing diplomatic cover for them globally by supporting them as an ally on the global stage. And the ignored calls for sanctions. Let's not, however, make it so that just Keir Starmer and David Lammy's let's not make it that it's just Keir Starmer and David Lammy that are the ones who are complicit in the kind of charges that have been handed down by the ICC today as an arrest warrants, right? David Cameron and the Conservative Party, these people are absolutely to blame as well. It was David Cameron as Foreign Secretary, who we know from the leaks from the head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns at the time, who was on record, she was recorded saying that they had been sent information saying there was likely war crimes being committed by Israel in Gaza, and they still did not cancel any weapons licenses, despite, according to this recording, being advised to do so. So the Conservative government that preceded this one, they are also complicit in what we have seen on these charges that have been handed down as well. Unfortunately, all the other people that are complicit in these crimes, of course, the ringleader in these crimes, which is Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken and the people in the United States, they will never be held accountable. They do not sign up to the Rome Statute. They're not members of the ICC. And in fact, they would even invade The Hague if any member of the United States was ever held accountable for the crimes that they have been absolutely complicit in, not just in Israel, but historically as well. So they're not being held to account, unfortunately. But there are plenty of other Western leaders in this world who now must be quaking in their boots for the full-throated support they have given for Israel to commit these heinous crimes and atrocities in Gaza. Plenty of Western leaders must now know that their time as free people must surely be on a smallest and thinnest of threads. Olaf Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, Ursula von der Leyen, Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, and many others have continued to support Israel and sell them the weapons they have used to commit these war crimes, right? Many of these other countries have also been complicit, and their leaders must surely be next in line when we finally find out in how many years' time the full extent of the crimes that have been committed in Gaza. What should the governments do? What should our government do right now? Immediately, in the wake of these charges that have been laid at the feet of Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, we need a full embargo on all weapon sales to Israel. We need sanctions, economic and diplomatic sanctions on Israel to force them into a position to come and try and actually have a ceasefire talk so we continue to virtue signal what we want whilst providing no actual material difference to what Israel does in practice. And we should expel the Israeli investors from our shores as they are clearly not worthy of staying here, just as they have been done so in South America as well. A momentous day for justice for Palestinians is right around the corner.
And we can't wait for it. Now, the ICC's arrest warrants specifically concern Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, but Israeli aggression, of course, has not been confined to the Palestinian territory. Since the end of September, Israel has been conducting an intense bombing campaign in Lebanon and a ground invasion in the country's south. Israeli aggression has killed over 3,500 people in Lebanon, and more than 1 million people have been forced to flee their homes. Swathes of South Lebanon have been completely destroyed. On Tuesday, UNICEF announced that at least 200 children have been killed in Lebanon in the past 2 months. UNICEF spokesperson James Elder said this: "Despite more than 200 children killed in Lebanon in less than 2 months, a disconcerting pattern has emerged. Their deaths are met with inertia from those able to stop this violence. For the children of Lebanon, it has become a silent normalization of horror." Elder also cited the chilling similarities between Lebanon and Gaza in terms of the proportion of children killed. But a ceasefire deal could be on the horizon, although we have heard that before in the case of Gaza. This week, US envoy Amos Hochstein said a ceasefire was within grasp after meeting Lebanese officials in Beirut to discuss a deal proposed by America. Hezbollah has indicated that it will accept the text of the US's ceasefire deal with some comments. Hochstein said there had been, quote, positive progress and that the gap between Israel and Hezbollah's position had narrowed. Earlier today, I spoke to Dr. Maha Shwaib, director of the Center for Lebanese Studies at the University of Cambridge. I began by asking her about the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant.
It's a long-awaited decision, and I think people in the region has almost given up on international law. I think this has been probably the main disillusion that many people feel is one of the outcomes of the ongoing genocide in Palestine. So it's a good step because despite all the intimidation that ICC had, experienced, they were brave enough to take this step. Is it too late? Maybe for many people it's very late. For the over 45,000 people killed in Gaza and almost 3,500 in Lebanon, it's a bit too late. But I hope it will be a step that would speed up bring an end to the war. I don't know if it will, unfortunately, but I hope that it will put more pressure. And it will be a test for whether we can bring countries that have become completely, out of the international law system, if we can really bring international law back into implementation.
So on the prospects of the end of this war, the US envoy Amos Hochstein has been in Lebanon in the last few days trying to negotiate a ceasefire between Hezbollah, the Lebanese government, and Israel. He seems to have had some success, according to his verdict on those meetings. Hezbollah has apparently agreed to the terms of the ceasefire with some comments. And in the Lebanese parliament, a speaker talked about UN Resolution 1701, which I think has the requirement that Hezbollah does not occupy any territory roughly 20 miles north of the Lebanese-Israeli border. That deal now goes to Israel, what do you think the prospects are for a ceasefire in the near future?
So this deal was reached on the day when Israel assassinated Nasrallah. At that moment, there was an agreement, and people thought that basically Israel approved the ceasefire, and the implementation of the 1701. But then what we witnessed at that time is just the escalation of Israeli aggression on Lebanon. So this was the first time when Lebanon thought that they've really have reached a ceasefire, but it turned out that Israel was not really, it was just basically a trap. So this is why I think Lebanese are very cautious about being optimistic that a ceasefire will happen. Maybe we are a bit closer because Israel on the ground, although they've managed to assassinate many of Hezbollah's leaders, they haven't been able to achieve much progress in terms of moving into the southern village because there is a strong resistance from Israeli fighters. And I think that is applying pressure on Israel. Now, the other challenge I think that Israel also has is how will the Israeli public see a ceasefire? Today, we saw one of the spokesperson from one of the settlements in the southern part of occupied Palestine saying that they are that they would consider any ceasefire agreement basically, Israel acknowledging that they've lost the war. So this is where we have to see, to what extent Netanyahu will want to please the right wing, which is unfortunately the vast majority of Israelis are for continuation of the war with Lebanon. So this is where we really don't know whether there will be enough pressure from the US on Israel to end this war. But also the other reality is on the ground, Israel is unable to continue this war. There is a fatigue amongst the soldiers. Yesterday there was a report about how, the impact of the war also on Israel. And yesterday also we saw Naim Qassem, the new leader of Hezbollah, saying that they are ready for a long conflict, a long war, but the cost is going to be high, obviously, on Lebanon, but as well as on Israel. So can Israel continue and sustain the cost of this? This is going to be one of the main issues. I think Hezbollah is getting much stronger now. And as Naim Qassem said clearly, yes, the first 10 days after the assassination of almost the top leaders of Hezbollah, the party has been weakened, but now they seem to have recollected their strength, and they are actually making very good progress on the ground, and they've costed Israel over 100 soldiers now, and Israel, despite all of the military support and advancement that they have compared to what Hezbollah's weapons, they haven't managed. Yes, they, as usual, they can destroy. And now when we look at their targets in Beirut, they're just targeting buildings. So this is what I think it could go either way. And then I would say 50-50 are the expectations of whether we will see a ceasefire or not.
Yeah, you mentioned there Hezbollah saying that they are ready for a long war. Now, obviously, that's an organization that emerged in the early 80s during the 1982 to 2000 occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel. And you also grew up in southern Lebanon during that period. What can you tell me about growing up under Israeli occupation and the emergence of Hezbollah at that time? I mean, that region is sometimes referred to as a Hezbollah stronghold. Is that an accurate description?
So Hezbollah only came after Israel had reached the capital of Beirut. Within a few months, Israel was able to reach and occupy almost most of Lebanon. And Hezbollah came as a result of that occupation, and people's losing faith in the other political parties that they thought will stand up to Israel attacks. It's funny. I remember growing up as a child when someone would say, "I'm not part of any political party," because political parties were seen as something very negative at that time because of the civil war. They would say, "I'm with the party of God," and then Hezbollah was created and became the party of God. That's basically what it means. So when I have guests coming to the south of Lebanon and they say, oh, well, could we meet someone from Hezbollah? I always tell them, we've already met a few and spoken already to few. Hezbollah is part of the community of the south of Lebanon. It gained a lot of popularity because of its resistance to Israeli occupation. I mean, Lebanon is the only country where Israel withdrew from an occupied land after it occupied for 18 years because of the resistance. If there was no resistance, Israel would still be occupying us. At the moment, Israel was stopping the ceasefire is they want the right to be able to bomb Lebanon at any moment in time when they think there's a threat on them. This is what I've experienced for 18 years of occupation. At any moment, you'd have an Israeli airplane on top of your head with, the sound of the, what they call now MK or the drones. This was the noise that, I grew up with constantly. We had nicknames for them as well. So at any moment, Israel could strike you. At that time, these drones, they didn't have any gun machines attached to them, but they basically, they could see anything that you're doing. So at any moment, you could have an airplane or a bomb that would fall on your head, or you could have a commandos force just basically landing in your land. And this is why I remember as a 15-year-old, we were sleeping in our beds, and then suddenly an Israeli commandos force landed and started spreading into the village. So this is the reality of occupation. This is what people in the West Bank are experiencing on a daily basis, and they've experienced for over 76 years.
Your academic speciality is education, and you've been studying the impact of this war on education and children in Lebanon. What can you tell us about your findings?
Part of studying the impact of the war, we produced 2 reports, one on the impact of the war on Gaza, on children in Gaza, and now, unfortunately, we had to do a second report, this time on Lebanon. Both reports are showing us a devastating impact. Obviously, in Gaza, like we haven't seen ever something like this happening before, with the huge impact in terms of the trauma these children have witnessed, the amputations, the disabilities, the difficulty of reopening schools because these schools have become a place where they've witnessed massacres and their families being killed. So now we're beginning to talk about, not almost the whole educational infrastructure has been destroyed, but also how you could reconcile these children with these spaces that have become a site of trauma. In Lebanon, at the moment, the vast majority of children are without education. Lebanon has already experienced a compounding crisis, whether with COVID or the economic crisis of 2019. Children have lost over 60% of their schooling, and now with this war, it's very likely that they will lose at least another year, depending on how long this war will last. And we should also remember that children in the south of Lebanon have already lost almost a year last year because they have been displaced. We're talking about over 10,000 people who have been displaced last year of children. So this year we have many schools who are destroyed. We have children who cannot learn online and cannot go in person because now more than half of the schools have turned into shelters to accommodate over 1.3 million displaced people. So, it's a devastating impact for a country that has a very weak infrastructure, that is trying to deal with extreme economic crisis, devaluation of its currency. So unfortunately, Lebanon always used to pride itself with the educational system, the highly qualified young people that this educational system produces. Now, for the first time, we're beginning to see extremely deteriorating performance rates for Lebanese children in international assessments. And now children in Lebanon have, according to some assessments, have lost at least 50 to 60% of what they are expected to know and be capable of doing in a certain age. So we have a major loss of learning for both Lebanese children, but also Palestinian children.
That was Dr. Maha Shwaib of the Center for Lebanese Studies at Cambridge University speaking to me earlier today. And we've had an update while we were playing that interview. We've had some more news from Lebanon. At least 47 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in the east of the country. And Israeli airstrikes have also hit the southern suburbs of Beirut approximately a dozen times. Ukraine has claimed that Russia has fired an intercontinental ballistic missile, also known as an ICBM, into Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian military reports that 9 missiles were fired at critical infrastructure in the city of Dnipro in central Ukraine between 5 and 7 a.m. local time. 6 of the 9 missiles were destroyed by air defenses. Now, the missiles are thought to have been launched from Russia's southern Astrakhan region, about 800 kilometers from Dnipro. The BBC reports this account of the damage from the head of Ukraine's Dnipro region. A 57-year-old man was treated for his injuries on the scene, and a 42-year-old woman has been taken to a hospital, Serhii Lysak writes on Telegram. A rehab center for people with disabilities was damaged in the attack, but there are no reported injuries there. In addition, 9 garages are also reported damage, and an industrial enterprise, Lysak adds. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said this about the attack. Today, it was a new Russian missile. All the parameters, speed, altitude, match those of an intercontinental ballistic missile. All expert evaluations are underway. A senior Ukrainian military official told the Financial Times that the missile was an RS-26 Rubez, a weapon with a range of 6,000 kilometers. Now, if what Ukraine is saying is true, then it will be the first time an ICBM has been used in any conflict. But some officials have poured cold water on the claim. ABC reports that an unnamed Western official has said that while the missile was a ballistic missile, it was not an intercontinental ballistic missile. And Vladimir Putin himself has come out today and said it was a missile of intermediate range. On the definition of an ICBM, the Financial Times says this. Some analysts dispute the classification of RS-26 as an intercontinental missile, arguing that because it has a shorter range than most ICBMs, it sits in a grey area between that designation and an intermediate range missile. But under the US and Russia's New START nuclear arms control treaty of 2010, an ICBM was defined as a land-based ballistic missile with a range in excess of 5,500 kilometers. Now, ICBMs are not new weapons, with both the US and Russia having had them in their arsenals since the Cold War, primarily designed to deliver nuclear warheads over ranges of up to 15,000 kilometers in some cases. ICBMs can also be armed with conventional explosions. So if the missile was an ICBM, what advantage does Russia gain by firing it? Pavel Podvik, senior researcher at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva, said this. Using these kinds of missiles, whether RS-26 or a true ICBM in a conventional role, does not make a lot of sense because of their relatively low accuracy and high cost. But this kind of strike might have a value as a signal. And speaking to the Kyiv Independent, defense expert Fabian Hoffman from the University of Oslo said this. This strike is not for military value. This is purely for political purposes. They probably considered testing a nuclear warhead, which was also rumored to happen soon, but decided that's too intense, and that could invite too much backlash, especially from partners such as China and India. And then they probably thought that this is the next best option because it sends a clear signal to the West while potentially not antagonizing critical international partners. And Hoffman went on to say this to the Financial Times. The signal here is, today the strike was with a non-nuclear payload, tomorrow it could be a nuclear one. There certainly was no military value to it. If it was about striking certain targets, there would have been many more and more capable missile systems for that. The Russian ballistic missile strike, whether intercontinental or not, comes just a day after Ukraine fired British Storm Shadow missiles into Russian territory for the first time. And it comes just 2 days after Ukraine fired US-made attacker missiles into Russia too. Yesterday, several embassies in Kyiv shut their doors after receiving intelligence of a significant and imminent air attack. Helena, things certainly seem to be hotting up. What's your take on all of this?
I mean, looking at a lot of the information that's come out of this one, I do not think the differentiation between whether it is an intercontinental ballistic missile or an intermediate range missile, I don't think that's any different. From what I'm aware of, a lot of the different speculated makes or genres of the missiles that could potentially have been used here, most of these can have potential nuclear payloads, right? Whether tactical or not. So the issue here, of course, is, as has been said in the statements that I agree with, that this is purely for political purposes. This is a show of force. This is a response to the green light that's been given by the United States and the UK for military aid that's given to Ukraine for them to use to strike targets inside of Russia could potentially in future lead to some kind of nuclear response. Now, is in keeping with the update to the nuclear doctrine that was passed by Vladimir Putin to consider all people whose weapons have been given to Ukraine to use against Russian targets inside Russia as also being participants within the conflict, right? This is very dangerous. This is incredibly dangerous. And not to get personal for a bit, but I have been personally, staunchly and resolutely in support of Ukraine from defending themselves from Russian aggression, and also in support of military aid being given to Ukraine to facilitate the defense of their country from Putin's illegal invasion and unjustified invasion of their territory in the Donbass and beyond. I've continually supported both of those positions. But any pushback on the green light that's been given for these strikes inside Russian territory rather than defensive ones inside Ukrainian territory to repel invasion forces has even something as simple as maybe these things that could potentially lead to nuclear escalation. I've gotten responses calling me a Putin shill or calling me somebody who doesn't actually support the defense of Ukraine. And I just want these people to just think for 1 second what the potential consequences of this could be. Every single time that we have ever come close to there being some kind of nuclear attack since 1945 in history has all been when people saw something that they thought looked like a nuclear attack and potentially got close to pushing the button to retaliate. For example, there was a probe that was sent out by Norway which looked similar to a trajectory of a potential Soviet launch of an ICBM from their territory, and the red box was brought to the White House to potentially launch a nuclear response. Any potential nuclear attack by Russia on Ukraine, which comes from whether an intermediate range or an intercontinental ballistic missile, could potentially be interpreted at launch at being a nuclear attack. Any amount of perceived ambiguity into whether or not one of these missiles has a nuclear payload or not could potentially lead to nuclear escalation from whichever side believes that the other side was going to fire first. We cannot get the conflict into this position. We cannot let this escalate to the point at which any of these things might be on the table. As has been rumored, as has been said in the just pieces that we had said before, there is a rumored potential test of potential tactical nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine by Russia, and that can only make things escalate further, far more than they have escalated so far. I believe, of course, that one of the main points of military aid to Ukraine is to give them the conventional weapons that they need to repel the Russian invasion to the point at which Russia feel like they have to come to the table. It's important to understand that if we want there to be a diplomatic solution to this conflict, Russia needs to feel like there might be a potential that they could not win, which involves there being enough conventional weapons for Ukraine to be able to repel that, to bring Putin to the table for a negotiated settlement. But escalating it to the point which Russia might feel like they need to engage in something that's far more than just conventional war makes those negotiations far less likely. This is something that is not going to end the conflict. For the love of God, think about what the consequences could be of this escalation. And I have worries that we are going to see things move much further than we've seen so far.
If you're like me, you may have noticed something in the air. Ever since Donald Trump won the US presidential election, some on the left seem to have taken a distinctly pessimistic turn when it comes to left-wing organizing and left-wing projects. The argument sometimes goes that the issues are fringe and that they don't connect with ordinary people. And the suggestion can sometimes seem to be that the left should give up on those issues and the people they concern in favor of a wider electoral acceptability. But just this week, one of those so-called fringe issues has hit right at the heart of American politics. Sarah McBride is the first out transgender woman to be elected to the US House of Representatives. She represents the state of Delaware. But instead of being able to get on with the job of improving the lives of her constituents, she's been dragged into a battle over which bathroom she'll be allowed to use. Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace is pushing to block McBride from using women's bathrooms in her place of work, and she has the backing of the Republican Speaker of the House. US network ABC caught up with Mace on Capitol Hill, and I should warn you that some may find Mace's comments pretty upsetting.
with your piece of legislation about banning women from
100%
using...
yes.
My question to you is...
And it doesn't go far enough. I'll be filing more bills.
You have said that it was created in response to Congresswoman-elect McBride.
100%. And
but should legislation be created targeted at one specific person?
It doesn't mention anyone in the legislation, but
you've said it was aimed at her.
No, I have said it's a result of this. I'm not going to allow biological men into women's private spaces. I will stand in the brink and stand in the way of anyone on the radical left who thinks that it's okay for a penis to be in a women's locker room or a bathroom or a changing room. Hell no. I'm not going to stand for it. And the Speaker said it would be in the House rules package. If it's not, I'll be ready with a motion, a privileged motion to force a vote on this. This is not okay. I'm a survivor of rape. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. And I'm not going to allow any man in any female private spaces.
Now, Speaker,
end of story. And by the way, I'm getting death threats from men pretending to be women. Why is it that these crazy people, the insanity, the radical left, are willing to kill women over a man's right to be in a women's restroom?
Speaker Johnson has said he wants to treat every new member with the words dignity and respect. Forcing this congressperson to go into a male restroom, is that dignity and respect?
Forcing women to share private spaces with men is not dignity and not respect. And I'm absolutely going to stand in the way of anyone who thinks it's okay for a man to be in our locker room, in our changing rooms, in our dressing rooms, in women's bathrooms. And in fact, if you agree with that, you're crazy.
Now, that was some intensely transphobic nonsense, but I think it was worth showing and is an example of what trans people face, especially in a climate where the right controls so much of the media narrative over their existence. And is that really how most people want trans women to be treated, just for trying to do their jobs? Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had, I think, a pretty good response to Mace.
What Nancy Mace and what Speaker Johnson are doing are endangering all women and girls. Because if you ask them, what is your plan on how to enforce this? They won't come up with an answer. And what it inevitably results in are women and girls who are primed for assault because people are going to want to check their private parts in suspecting who is trans and who is cis and who's doing what. And so the idea that Nancy Mace wants little girls and women to drop trow in front of who? An investigator? Who would that be? Because she wants to suspect and point fingers at who she thinks is trans is disgusting. It is disgusting. And frankly, all it does is allow these Republicans to go around and bully any woman who isn't wearing a skirt because they think she might not look woman enough.
Now, for her part, Sarah McBride has responded with remarkable grace, saying this: "I'm not here to fight about bathrooms. I'm here to fight for Delawareans and to bring down costs facing families. Like all members, I'll follow the rules as outlined by Speaker Johnson, even if I disagree with them. This effort to distract from the real issues facing this country hasn't distracted me over the last several days." Now, there's no doubt that being confronted with the right in power is a dispiriting moment, but does the mood of pessimism mean that we should abandon what are considered minority positions because they'll never translate into victories that change the course of history? Well, history itself says no. The weekend, as we know it, was hard won by the efforts of trade unions and workers. In the 19th century, workers would only have Sunday as a rest day to recover from the week, although many observed the unofficial and secular custom of Saint Monday, where workers would take Monday off to claw back a little bit of leisure time. By the early 20th century, trade unions were campaigning for a full 2-day weekend and a 40-hour working week, making up 5 8-hour days. No longer would workers have to take whatever long hours bosses and factory owners decreed. It took mass strike action met by bloody police violence in the form of the Battle of George Square, an intervention by Boots the chemist, and an increase in trade union membership following the Second World War for the weekend to become standard practice in the 1930s, not even 100 years ago. But this victory was not handed down benevolently from above. It was fought for by working class people and won. Civil rights for Black Americans were similarly hard won by nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience for decades. Segregation and discrimination was enshrined in law, and white people could murder their Black counterparts with impunity. Civil rights activists were met by racist mob violence and police brutality, but they were not deterred and eventually won landmark victories, striking down racist laws and banning discrimination. LGBTQ+ rights were seen as unpopular fringe issues relating to sexual deviance well into the 1990s in the UK. Let's not forget that Margaret Thatcher's Section 28, preventing the discussion of queer identities in school, was only repealed in England and Wales in 2003, 21 years ago. And across the Atlantic, same-sex sexual activity was only federally decriminalized in the same year. In the 1950s, homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. Queer and trans people were arrested for their sexuality and gender presentation. They were forced into psychiatric care and put on government lists. Gay men were essentially abandoned and left to die by the Reagan administration during the AIDS epidemic. But a spontaneous collective uprising after a violent police raid known as the Stonewall Riots in 1969 sparked a gay rights movement that conservative and religious leaders in the US are still, to this day, trying to suppress. The Stonewall Uprising was led by Black and Latina trans women like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Public opinion in the US may be divided on trans rights in 2024, as well as in the UK, but it doesn't mean that the same shift that perceptions of same-sex marriage has undergone can't apply here. Working class people having the vote, women being able to vote, the abolition of slavery, civil rights, LGBTQ+ rights, protections for workers, these were all once seen as fringe issues by the majority. But now they're so familiar that we take them for granted. The social issues we care deeply about don't have to be viewed in opposition to the left's economic project either. They should go hand in hand with economic justice, even in the face of the crushing stranglehold of neoliberalism as a grip of us all. And this is also not to say that we shouldn't be taking time to reflect on messaging strategy and how we win people over. But I guess remembering why we're on the left and those core values of respect, peace, dignity, and fairness is vital. Now, I'm about to be joined by Francesca Fiorentini, a journalist, comedian, and host of the Bitchuation Room podcast. Francesca, it's really great to have you here. How are you?
Good. Yes, Stephen, nice to be with you. And I thought that was a brilliant rundown of what's been going on just in the few weeks since Donald Trump was reelected. So I'm okay. I'm disturbed. Actually, every day I get more disturbed, although I guess we have Matt Gaetz withdrawing his nomination for Attorney General. Obviously, Matt Gaetz, child sex trafficker, likely slept with 17-year-olds at sex parties fueled by drugs and whatnot. And but I think that was a brilliant intro to this issue. And I find it really disturbing the way that specifically some people on the left and progressives think that perhaps we should be cutting out our trans brothers and sisters, the trans, people in our lives, in American life specifically in this case, in order to win over Trump voters. And that's just not just sort of morally wrong and bankrupt, just sort of reactionary as a strategy, but it also doesn't respond and speak to, I think, the trends that we're seeing in the United States. I don't think that bore out in the data. We're now getting more and more as, again, votes continue to be counted actually from the US presidential election, especially in my state of California, where you can mail in ballots the day of. We're seeing that Harris actually was the one who didn't perform. Donald Trump did worse than he did in 2020. It's Harris and the Democrats that didn't actually perform well. They didn't get their voters out. They didn't get their base out. And that was for a myriad of reasons. And I would even argue it might be because they didn't stand with trans people and have a plan to protect LGBTQ plus people, just as they didn't have a plan to protect abortion rights, right? Or they tried to outline it, but it wasn't really clear. Joe Biden not willing to do very much in that scenario, given that Dobbs came down during his presidency. But you saw these attacks on groups like trans people. You saw the attacks on Haitian immigrants legally here. And where was the counter? Where was the defense? Where was the narrative that said, no, trans people, Haitian migrants, these are part of the fabric of American society. And we stand with them as we build an economic agenda, a plan that works for everyone. As we talk about housing and healthcare and climate justice, as we talk about reproductive rights, as we talk about all of these things, and they were nowhere to be found. I mean, let alone the media. On Novara, I don't need to explain to you how the media abdicates its duty to actually humanize these groups as well. But I really think that Sarah McBride's election, I'm sorry I'm running on, but I think that her election is so pivotal. I'm glad that we're having this discussion, because Sarah McBride is proof that actually something that so many of us are so easy to discount, like, oh, representation doesn't matter. That's all identity politics. No, it matters. There you had a Democratic congresswoman saying on national television very clearly, this is a distraction. I'm focused on helping everyday people, all people. And I would have liked to hear maybe a little bit more about how she plans to protect all trans people. But we wouldn't have been able to hear that had this entire mountain out of a molehill not been made by Nancy Mace, who literally is in a Cruella de Vil outfit. Everyone needs to remember that. But Stephen, I'm talking too much. I'm so fired up about it.
No, not talking too much at all. It was great. I guess I want to ask you another kind of criticism that's made of the left, which is that what this election shows and previous right-wing election shows, but perhaps for some reason this one is really coming into focus, I think, because there's an understanding that Donald Trump is offering an attractive economic solution to what you in America call middle-class people. We wouldn't use that term here, but to working-class people, as we would say here. Economically attractive packages, like populist packages, maybe involving direct economic interventions or that kind of thing. And so one kind of criticism that can be made of the left is that it's lost track of the economic argument and it's really just concerned with issues of social justice. What do you and that needs to be reoriented? Do you think that these things are separable or should be separated, or do you think they come as a package?
I think number one, we just have to distinguish with who we're talking about. When we talk about the Democrats and the Democratic leadership, that's very different than when we're talking about the left, which truly doesn't exist in this country. But social movements, those who came out against the genocide in Gaza on the streets and then were summarily, brutalized. Same thing in 2020. The children of the Great Recession, the children of Occupy Wall Street. So I just want to distinguish between the two of them. When it comes to the Democrats, I absolutely think that they use empty identity politics and sort of just rhetorically, inclusive language in order to paper over the fact that they have been hook, line, and sinker in with neoliberal economics, as well as war and militarism that have done nothing but backfire on, yes, the working class, but to say nothing of the world. And they're wildly out of step with their base, right? It's not even their base. 77% of Americans do not believe that we should be sending more weapons to Israel. And yet $20 billion later, here we are. So I just want to name that, yes, Democratic leadership absolutely uses, just surface identity politics in order to paper over their own missteps. When it comes to the left, who they like to blame, no, it was the extremists. We were catering to the extremists. They were not catering to the extremists. Kamala Harris is there saying she owns a Glock. Kamala Harris is campaigning with Liz Cheney, someone who is so toxic, the Cheney family, that not even Republicans will campaign with her because they understand that 8 years of the war on terror under Bush did nothing but, maim and murder Iraqis and Afghans and Pakistanis and, gave us a lot of PTSD and, $3 trillion worth of debt when you talk about the working class here. But I really want us to remember, because as we talk about this, that I think that some on the left can be seduced into the idea that, yes, all identity politics are wrong without truly understanding and be class reductionist about it without understanding that the working class in the United States, your average working class person, is what? Is a woman of color, just straight up. She's Latina, she's Asian, she might be working, as a domestic worker. She is an immigrant. That is who makes up the working class in this country. And so it was a massive misstep for someone like Kamala Harris to not only never say working class, she said middle class, which is funny that you mentioned that because you're right. We don't really have a middle class in this country. The idea of being upwardly mobile really doesn't exist anymore. It's about getting by. Most Americans I think it is $400 of an unforeseen expense away from being homeless. or being, going into debt. Like that is massive. So the fact that Kamala Harris wasn't even able to say working class, and the fact that she is a woman of color and yet wasn't able to speak to the majority of women of color in this country who overwhelmingly voted for her, but who also need an economic plan that, again, brings everyone along, but of course disproportionately would affect and impact people of color, women in this country. So we need to parse out who we're talking about, but I do think it is a misstep. And I understand it. When you see someone weaponize, like, first Black woman, first Indian American woman, wow, isn't that? When you see someone simply use that as a stand-in for real ideas and real politics, I understand it makes us sour on the notion altogether. But we cannot let go of true intersectionality, of true revolutionary politics. I mean, even just the ways that Bernie Sanders was able to say, in every single one of his speeches, Black, white, Asian, Latino, gay, straight, like he just, it's like everybody get on the bus. We're transforming American society.
It's like so refreshing to hear someone say the words revolutionary politics. Like, I love to hear that. But how do you take, in terms of reflecting on this moment, and I think reflection is probably a pretty good thing. So, and I know I'm talking about the left, not the Democrats or liberals. What do you think the solution is to the question of how we make those ideas convincing to a broader electorate? What kind of reflection should we be taking at the moment on our strategies for communicating, our strategies for organizing? Yeah, what do you think? What do you think the answers are there? Or maybe you think that gap doesn't really exist at all?
No, I think it exists, but I do think that Democratic leadership has a huge responsibility, and I think the media has a huge responsibility. And I also think that the fact that, Novara, my channel, a lot of the channels that I work with, our media outlets are struggling, right? And I know that this is, user supported, and I think that's really, really important, but it's like, we are living in the death knell of media, not just mainstream media, but all media. And it's really frightening when you have billionaires, truly like fracking billionaires, who just funnel money into the far right media sphere in this country and get their message out there, whatever that might be, whether it's, usually it's attacking trans people as inroads to their like BS culture war distractions. It's all kinds of reactionary takes around how we cozy up to Israel, but cozy up to Israel, but also like shun Ukraine, as you were talking about Ukraine earlier. Like, it's so easy because fascism is very simple, right? And on the left, we have a plurality of ideas and voices and identities, and I think that is our strength. But we also are deeply underfunded. So even getting the message out there to people is really, really tough. But I will say, I think that organizing needs to happen far more locally and definitely circulating and surrounding, our workplaces. Even with some of the more, the headline grabbing stories around union drives, whether it's Starbucks and a lot of other retail outlets, Amazon, these things are awesome. But by and large in the United States, the number of unionized workers is shrinking and has steadily been shrinking. And so that I think is really critical as to how do we fight against that? I also think it's a call, and I'm not from the labor movement, but it definitely is a call to the labor movement of like, look, we throw down with Democrats every time. But also your base, your members are probably deeply unhappy about that. So what are we doing? How are labor movements going to get back to their militant and their, and their sort of wielding some power, like their militant roots, I think that is a question we're going to be confronting. And I am very much looking forward to a 2028 general strike, as UAW head Sean Fain has set out, and I think it's something to look forward to, a bright spot in this darkness.
And you've got to look for those bright spots. Before I let you go, Francesca, I want to ask you about Gates withdrawing as a pick for the Attorney General. Obviously, because details were about to emerge. Well, alleged details, let's say. Do you think that we're going to see similar crumblings of some of Trump's rather weird, odd picks for his cabinet?
It's so hard because Gates was uniquely despised by Republicans and obviously by Democrats. Like everyone hated him. He would show photos of these like orgies on his phone to members on the House floor, and like say what you will about Republicans. They're like, okay, even I have a line, but it is. All I can say is I think the House ethics report that has yet to come out because Republicans blocked it clearly has some details that are far worse than things that we already know about. And perhaps they involve, working with his friend Joel Greenberg of Florida. I believe he was I can't remember his role in city government, but basically like searching for people to possibly traffic using IDs that were confiscated by police. Like that kind of depravity, again, not proven, but that's what Joel Greenberg was doing. And the two of them were bosom buddies. Joel Greenberg serving 11 years for what he did. I mean, there was also financial crimes on top of that. So yeah, I mean, good. I'm glad he withdrew his name. It doesn't change the other rapey psychos that are currently still in the mix. This is par for the course. And I also feel like deeply it matters, but it also is kind of a massive distraction, kind of deliberately, because these people are all Christian nationalists, corporate loving, extremists, religious zealots. So what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do about it? And I think the thing that deeply frightens me is there is a lot of fatigue from 4 years of Trump prior. It's fatigue mainly from, I think, a lot of liberals and a lot of the sort of like resistance politics that really weren't able to take root, that really didn't give rise to a national organization or any kind of real policies that got put forward. We were all just in this sort of defense mode. And so that fatigue is actually leading to some institutions, whether it's nonprofits or whether it's media figures saying, you know what, maybe we can work with Donald Trump this time around. Maybe we can work with him. And that is, I think, absolutely unforgivable and actually terrifying. So I feel like grassroots organizations, real leftist radical organizations, have been left high and dry. And we're going to be seeing not just more extreme action from this administration, but maybe even, I think, an abandonment from liberal institutions of organizers and activists. And I actually think we've already seen that in the last year, given the ways that a lot of the liberal establishment and Democratic politicians allowed for the brutalization and the suppression of free speech when it comes to Palestine demonstrators. That was sort of a foreshadowing into what we will see in the future. And you just saw now a bill that was passed to give, I believe, the Treasury Secretary full reign to rescind 501c3 status from any nonprofit that it deems supporting terrorism, which of course we all know is up to interpretation, and terrorism charges are usually meant to stamp out any kind of dissent, no matter what issue it is. Could be environmental, or it could obviously be, being against genocide. And so we are in really perilous times. I don't know how else to put it.
Is there any optimism though that you can find even in the midst of all of this darkness?
June Jordan has this saying, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And I think that's so apt right now. Like, there is this sense that no one is coming to save us. No one is protecting us. Democratic Party leaders have folded. Joe Biden inviting Donald Trump to the White House as if he didn't try to stage a coup against him only 4 years ago. I mean, we have only ourselves to rely on. And I think if we're waiting for somebody, look in the mirror, that someone is you. And so I think that actually is a silver lining. And I say that not as an accelerationist who thinks things need to get terrible before they get better. I don't agree with that, because that truly means people will die. But I also think that so much of what the left has been saying in the United States and globally has borne out. And here we see it in the election, right? It's socialism or barbarism, people, right? Neoliberalism is done. It's dead. And the people who led us down that primrose path need to be excommunicated from political life. And so if this helps that, good. But it comes at a price, and it also means we have to get involved to defend our communities. I don't know. The silver lining is that, we know who's who now. We know who actually believes in, real transformation and real democracy, small d democracy, real justice, and who's willing to sell us out.
Francesca, Fiorentini, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Helena, I want to come to you now, if I can, on this topic of kind of left pessimism. What do you make of it?
I mean, going to the Sarah McBride stuff that you were speaking about earlier, the reason why they've been able to do this, why the GOP have been so vociferous in making their very initial statement to be, we're going to pass this very specific thing, attacking this one specific congressperson, is because they sense weakness. They sense weakness within the Democratic Party over splits over different issues, and they want to be able to make that divide further, right? So corporate Democrats, corporate establishment Democrats like Tom Swatsea in New York, immediately, as soon as the election was over, said the problem was we were too woke. We spent too much time defending trans people. And of course, that caused some splits in terms of the more kind of populist left of the Democratic Party and the mainstream centrists of the Democratic Party. And the Republicans go, well, if the Democrats are going to have these debates with amongst themselves, let's make sure that's center stage. Let's make sure that, rather than what the message should be coming from the Democratic Party and saying, look, the Republicans ran on the fact that we care more about identity issues than on economic policy, or instead of passing economic policy to help working class Americans, they're immediately starting to do performative nonsense, which would end up having to do genital inspections for people in Capitol Hill toilets, right? This should be the immediate message that you get. But of course, because corporate Democrats want this to be the conversation, they want it to be the conversation just as much as the GOP do, because they don't want to talk about economic populism. They don't want to talk about the Bernie Sanders messages that we had all of those years ago. The GOP are going to join forces with these people to make trans people the enemy. The issue, of course, is McBride's response of conceding this ground gets people nowhere. All it will do is make sure the Republicans push further and further and further to make things even harder and try and get further concessions, right? The more you try and concede on these bits and pieces, like, for example, on issues like prisons, for example, they won't stop. They won't say, oh, well, we've got these concessions, let's stop there. They'll go, no, these people are weak and let's push these things further. You have to stand your ground. You have to have convictions. And you have to, of course, use those positions to be able to talk about why they're being pushed. Bernie Sanders is somebody who has been continually socially progressive on all of these issues, on race, sexuality, gender, and on sex. And at no point has he ever felt like he needs to concede on these issues, yet still continually stand for the populist left-wing message on the economy that he's always stood for. There was an excellent clip of him speaking to students in the 90s that More Perfect Union shared on their social media platforms, of him saying about the Republican strategy is divide and rule. If you want tax breaks for billionaires, if you want there to be big pharma control over healthcare in the United States, what you do is you create an enemy. And you won't stop them from doing that by conceding. You won't, because again, they'll just push further. But what you have to do is take things back. During the election campaign, when Kamala Harris was asked about transgender issues, she just said, I want to obey the law. She didn't say, I want to obey the law, but also protect this community, but also specifically point out and say, there is no plan. There is no plan to help working class people from the Grand Old Party. There is nobody in the Republican Party who's talking about child tax credits or dealing with the housing crisis. Nobody's talking about that at all. But she just accepted the framing and left it at that, when Bernie Sanders would have been much better at pushing back on this same narrative. So have conviction. Don't concede. Don't look at the popularists, not populists, but popularists like David Shaw, who ran the Kamala Harris campaign saying, let's just appeal to median voter issues all the time and give up on these positions that we believe in just for short-term electoral gain. And they fucking lost. They lost by conceding on border issues, by conceding on trans issues, and even conceding on loads of economic messages as well, and palling around with Republicans like Liz Cheney. This was not a winning message. If we want to take some solace, is that Bernie Sanders did better in 2016 challenging Hillary Clinton after the failure of the Obama administration to make life better for ordinary working class Americans than he did in 2020 when fighting against Joe Biden, when the threat of Trump was the problem. In 2028, there will be no Trump. He will have served his 2 terms. Liberals can't be scared away by orange man bad anymore. There has to be a vision. There has to be a project for them to believe in. The time is now when people are disenchanted broadly across American society with what the corporate Democrats are laying down. They're not picking that up. We have to offer an alternative. There has to be an alternative from the left on economic populism. And to bring that round to the United Kingdom and where we stand right now, that's exactly the position that we are in right here. Keir Starmer is polling 3% behind the Conservative Party at 25% at the recent poll just come out from More in Common. He's not popular. His party isn't popular. And while some measures in the budget did see some support, if there is no broad left-wing message to challenge the centrists in the Labour Party, the far right will be waiting in the wings. But people support our economic positions when polled, right? The Green Party are seeing a surge in support. So what we need to be doing, rather than having a pessimistic attitude and saying, oh, well, it looks like the right have won on all of these issues, we have capitulated. No, we need to challenge and be there to pick up the pieces when the Starmer project inevitably fails. When it inevitably fails, we need to be there with an alternative to what we're seeing. Whether or not we are organising in our trade unions on the ground within our communities at a local level, whether or not we are organising within the Labour Party to challenge the centrists in the party, no matter how much you think that that is a not particularly viable avenue, given the changes to how the Labour Party functions under Keir Starmer, whether or not you've chosen to do what I have done, which is to join the Green Party as a left-wing alternative, who have immediately been calling for things like a ceasefire in Gaza, who've been calling for public ownership of our water industry, and who have been calling for far more progressive economic positions that benefit working class people, that have been more radical in looking at increases in the minimum wage, increases in trade union bargaining that Labour Party haven't touched. We can organise to have a real left-wing alternative as well. Now is the time. It's 5 years until the next elections. There are local elections coming up in future too. There are plenty of avenues that we have to enter the discourse, to be able to convince people that our positions are correct, given that we already have popular support for them. We all need to get ourselves out there and make sure we're campaigning. We did it in 2017. In 2017, Jeremy Corbyn was polling at around 30, just below 30% when there was the chicken coup to try and remove him as leader. We got onto the streets. We talked to people. We met people where they were. We promised them, we looked at them and said, here is our progressive economic platform to fix all the damage that austerity did. We can do that again. The first thing is to get rid of the pessimism, is to think of what we could be doing if we organised. And the work for that starts now.
Absolutely. And like the one thing that we know politically is that there is absolutely nothing to learn from liberals and centrists about electoral strategy, given these last elections. Like the DNC lost miserably. The Labour Party won, but only in the face of a massive collapse in Tory support. But there are things to learn from the right, not the content of their ideas, but there is something about the discipline with which the right pursues their ideas and the way in which they relentlessly message those ideas in order to build an electoral base that perhaps the left actually can learn something from. That there has to be this relentless discipline about principle and about idea and about future projects. Helena, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's not a problem. One thing I would end on with was that Owen Jones mentioned on Twitter that the neoliberals did this. They organised the Mont Pelerin Society. They advocated for the idea for years and years and years when they weren't popular. They found their opening in the 1980s and the economic crises then. We have an economic crisis now. This is our opening. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, you're quite right, Helena. This is our moment. Right, well, that's it from us. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. My name's Stephen Methven. You join us tomorrow for another live show. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.